Chapter 13, Part 1, The Lily. Jim didn't dare ask where he was going, or whether he'd coming back, or if he could just run back to the cottage to say goodbye to Rosie. He was quite sure that Grandpa would tell her nothing. He imagined her hurrying out to him in the morning with a mug of tea and a chunk of solid bread, trying the locked door and calling out to him. He imagined Shrimps swinging his bootlaces over his head, dancing in the streets without him, waiting. He hung back, wanting to dodge into the shadows and run off. But, as if he could read his thoughts, grimy Nick swung out his arm and grabbed him by the collar. Jim hurried beside Nick, stealing quick glances up at him. Nick never returned his look, but stumped on, his boots sparking now and then when the cobbles were dry. He took him through narrow, dark alleys that threaded backwards and forwards between the wharves. Rats scuttled away from them. Skinny dogs started up from their sleep and settled down again. At last they came to a large warehouse with a row of carts lined up outside and "Best Coals of Cockerell & Co." painted on them, the letters gleaming white in the gloom. A man was leading a cart horse out of a barn, and he grunted at Nick. "Thought you weren't coming no more," he said, his voice hollow still with sleep. "Damn you," said grimy Nick. "You'd think the worst of the angel Gabriel, you would." He took Jim round to the front of the warehouse, where it overhung the river, and jumped onto the deck of a lighter that was moored there. It was a flat-nosed boat, about 80 foot long. Jim had seen plenty of them, working their way backwards and forwards with the tide, loaded up with tons of cargo from the big ships. It had the name Lily painted on it. It lay in the mud, deep in the stench of raw sewage that piled high against the banks at low tide. "Get on," Nick growled, and Jim jumped on the narrowboat combing boards that ran round the side of the boat, and he looked down onto it. Covering one end were planks of wood used for hatchboards, and across these was an oar. Swinging from the oar was a lantern, casting a dim light into the huge hold, which was piled high with coal. A large yellow-eyed dog rose up on its haunches as soon as Jim jumped onto the hatch, squaring itself to leap. A deep growl rumbled from it, and its teeth shone wet. Jim started back from it. Nick swung round, took him by the shoulders, and pushed him face down towards the dog. He could smell its sour breath. The dog flattened its ears and whined. Nick let go of Jim. "Now he's smelled you, he'll never forget you," he said. "Never. He'll know you belong on here, see?" "Yes," whispered Jim. "Which means," said Nick, "that if you tries to run away, he'll be after you. And he'll probably eat you alive. The faster you runs, the faster he runs, see?" Jim nodded. "So you better not try. Just let him taste you to sharpen his smell." He pushed Jim's arm down towards the dog. "Bite." The dog snapped its jaw so his teeth rested around Jim's wrist. He would have sunk his teeth right in if Jim hadn't have held himself steady, though every nerve in him was screaming out. "Leave," Nick said, and the dog sank back on his haunches, snarling. Jim nursed his arm. The teeth had just punctured the skin, and little points of blood were oozing there. "He's quite friendly," Nick said. "Just so long as you're friendly to me, see?" Jim nodded. He was too afraid to speak. "Well, we'll get along very well in that case," Nick said. He straightened himself up, took hold of his lantern and held it up, swinging it slowly from side to side. High up in Cockerell's warehouse, a shutter opened and a white face peered out. "Don't tell me you're ready," the white face shouted. "If we don't get this load out, we'll have lost tomorrow's tide as well as today's." "I knows that," shouted Nick. "I've been training my new boy." The white face disappeared and a door next to the window swung open. A large wicker basket that was roped to a winch was lowered slowly down, creaking as it came. Nick jumped down into the hold on top of the coals. "Lantern," he grunted, and Jim passed it down to him. "Well, get in." Jim scrambled down beside him, his feet slipping on lumps of coal as he landed. The inside of the lighter was like a black cave, gleaming with heaps of coal. It smelt of damp and sulphur. Nick thrust a shovel at him. The basket hovered just above the hold, and Nick eased it down, steadied it, and started shoveling coal into it, his body swinging into a deep, easy rhythm. Jim stabbed at the coals with his shovel. He had to lift it nearly as high as himself before he could tip it into the basket, and the few coals he had managed to lift slid off and bumped against him. He gave a little yelp of pain, and Nick stopped shoveling for a moment. He whistled in contempt. "Get on with it," he shouted.